June 23, 1944. Somewhere in the black water of the mid-Atlantic, a steel whale slid just under the skin of the sea. In the cramped control room of a giant cargo submarine, a commander steadied his breath and peered through the periscope one last time. The rendezvous had been perfect, equipment transferred, technicians aboard, the German escort fading into darkness. 2 tons of gold glinted in the hold beside tin, rubber, and hope. The plan was simple. Surface at night, run fast, disappear into Europe's shadow. Nothing on the horizon, nothing on the scope, nothing to fear. Within 3 hours, 96 souls would be gone, and the ocean would keep the secret on spools of whispering wire. They never saw the trap. It wasn't a destroyer's searchlight or a prowling convoy. It was a lattice of invisible ears, floating microphones that drank sound and sang it skyward. Aircraft circled in the moonless dark, listening to the throb of propellers, the creak of pressure hull, the heartbeat of a submarine that thought water was a shield. From above came the answer to that arrogance. An acoustic hunter, a torpedo that didn't need eyes, only sound. It fell, it listened, it curved, it struck. What followed sounded like a giant being crushed by unseen hands. And then, silence. If you stay with me to the end of this story, I'll show you how a handful of new ideas, cheap paper-wrapped buoys, a chiming sonar, and a torpedo that could hear, cracked open an empire's confidence. I'll show you why. Some of the most magnificent submarines ever built achieved almost nothing, while smaller, standardized boats turned an ocean into a grid. And at the very end, I'll tell you what survived from that night. The ghost in the archives that proves exactly how the ocean changed hands. Let's rewind. When war began, Japan's submarine force was a marvel. Long-legged boats ranged across the Pacific. Some could carry aircraft. Some could cross the world without refueling. Crews were seasoned, doctrine was disciplined, and the mission was glamorous. Stock warships, scout for the fleet, strike high-value targets. It felt modern. It felt invincible. Across the ocean, American submarines started the war with a secret shame. Their main torpedo often ran too deep, hit too soft, or refused to explode. But while captains cursed and risked careers to fix their own weapons, a machine larger than any captain kept turning. Factories, research labs, codebreakers, carriers, and a new concept. Make the sea talk. The numbers tell the story with a chill that no rhetoric can warm. Between 1941 and 1945, American submarines sank over 1,300 Japanese ships, about 3 million tons, more than half of all Japanese merchant losses. Japanese submarines, for all their daring and engineering brilliance, sank fewer than 200 Allied ships, about 1 million tons. That gap wasn't luck. It was design, doctrine, and a multiplying effect. Detection, coordination, and production working together like gears. Here's how the gears meshed. First gear. Put ears everywhere. Sonobuoys looked like nothing. Small cylinders tossed from aircraft like breadcrumbs. But each one dropped a microphone below the waves and radioed the ocean's secrets into the sky. One aircraft could scatter 5, 10, 15 of them in colored patterns and then tune from buoy to buoy, painting a submarine's path and sound. Once a submarine dived to escape, it didn't vanish. Its noise just moved from the eye to the ear. Second gear. Give the ear a bite. The acoustic torpedo, nicknamed FIDO by those who used it, did something almost magical for 1944. It homed on the target's noise, the signature churn of propellers. The pilot didn't need to see you. The destroyer didn't need to be nearby. If your boat moved, the torpedo learned your rhythm and curved into it. Escape maneuvers only made more sound. Third gear. Put the orchestra on a floating stage. Escort carriers, small aircraft carriers built in huge numbers. Launch squadrons dedicated to one job. Hunt submarines. Radar found them on the surface. Sonobuoys stalked them underwater. Acoustic torpedoes finished the conversation. This wasn't chance meeting chance. It was a system swallowing an opponent. For the men in those steel tubes, this shift felt like sorcery. Dive, and the enemy still knew where you were. Change course, and the pattern of buoys shifted with you. Go silent, and the torpedo listened harder. The ocean, once a vast hiding place, shrunk to a web, and then came the chime that broke a myth. Japanese planners believed some waters were safe by geometry alone. Lay enough mines in the narrow gates to the Sea of Japan, and submarines would turn away. The math seemed flawless. Then 9 American submarines fitted with a new sonar pushed for the Tsushima Strait in June 1945. This sonar didn't just detect ships. It etched obstacles. It rang when it heard mines. The crews called it Hell's Bells. Because the sound announced doom for the mines, not for them, guided by the chime. The boats threaded the labyrinth and popped into a reservoir of shipping that had grown too comfortable behind a wall of explosives. In a matter of days, those 9 submarines tore into coastal traffic, warships, and cargo alike. 28 ships sunk in waters that were supposed to be a fortress moat. To the men on the receiving end, the realization was instant and devastating. If the straits could be crossed, nowhere was safe. If mines could be mapped, barriers were theater props. If submarines could chart their way through death, they could write an obituary for an island nation's supply lines. While that tactical revolution unfolded, a quieter storm raged behind the scenes. Codebreakers read schedules. Radar sets on submarines picked up contacts beyond sight. Fire control computers turned angles and speed into firing solutions at a twist of a dial. Standardized parts flowed from factories that never slept. When a boat was damaged, parts waited. When a boat was lost, another slid down a ramp with a fresh crew and a sharpened doctrine. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States launched over 300 fleet submarines, built from interchangeable components sourced from dozens of states. Every improvement, better sonar, better radar, better batteries, scaled. Japan had brilliance. America had brilliance with volume, and volume makes its own strategy. American boats learned to aim not just at warships, but at the veins and arteries of a war economy. Tankers, freighters, colliers, transports. Hit those every day, and the enemy bleeds while its heart still beats. By 1944, American submarines were averaging roughly a ship a day. Rice didn't move, oil didn't flow, factories slowed, fleets idled, and even brave crews grew thin. The psychological effect on Japanese submariners compounded with each patrol. Imagine diving to escape a plane and hearing depth charges fall in a pattern that matches your turns. Imagine feeling a torpedo turn with you, as if it had a mind and your scent. Imagine surfacing at night and seeing radar waves rather than stars. The ocean begins to feel like a room with security cameras in every corner and microphones hidden in the walls. Some of Japan's most spectacular boats, the giant aircraft-carrying submarines that could theoretically strike the Panama Canal or the American coast, ended the war without firing a shot in anger. Not because they were poorly built, because their missions required invisibility, and invisibility was gone. Their size, once an asset, became an acoustic signature, a radar return, a bigger shadow in a world where shadows were traceable. When surrender came, some commanders chose death over the humiliation of demonstration. Others watched as American teams toured their boats, traced wiring, spun periscope heads, and tapped hulls with practiced knuckles. The visiting engineers were impressed by specific pieces, the ambition, the range, the hangars, but unimpressed by the system. Where Japan had handcrafted marvels, America had engineered a pipeline. From lab bench to shipyard to dock to sea, upgrades arrived like the tide, and that difference matters. Individual excellence loses to integrated, repeatable excellence. A single glorious submarine cannot outfight 1,000 good sonobuoys. The toll on human life was horrific. Japanese submarines suffered losses that would have shattered any branch's morale. Over 130 boats gone, and a casualty rate for crews that soared above 70%. Families learned to read assignments as obituaries. Young men understood that submarine school meant farewell. By 1945, it wasn't merely dangerous to go to sea in a Japanese submarine. It felt like surrendering to statistics. Meanwhile, American boats, after solving their torpedo crisis by 1943, hunted with increasing confidence. They carried 24 torpedoes and were encouraged to use them freely. Resupply was certain. Japanese boats often had to be stingy because production couldn't keep pace. When you must save each shot, you take fewer risks. When you take fewer risks, you find fewer targets. When you fire less, you learn slower. The spiral tightens. Now, About that night in 1944, the one that opened this story, when the aircraft found the cargo submarine on radar, it dropped flares and forced a crash dive. A near miss shook plates and pride, but the ocean still felt like refuge. Then the pilot seeded the sea with purple and orange and red listening posts, tuned his radio across their frequencies, and heard the boat below draw a line of sound through the water. He set the weapon loose. It followed the line. The crew above didn't just see the kill. They heard it crackle, groan, break. Then a long, low moment where the ocean exhaled. Those wire recordings survived. Thin spools marked by hand, stored, forgotten, rediscovered, studied. Decades later, analysts replayed the sounds with modern tools and confirmed what the first listeners already knew in their bones. An acoustic torpedo, guided by sonobuoys, had sealed a steel coffin in the black. Consider the chain it took to make that moment possible. A science lab designing a hydrophone that could survive pressure and salt. A factory stamping the casing. A radio set built to shrug off static. A training syllabus that taught pilots to seed buoys and patterns. A logistics train that put those buoys on a carrier deck in the right color sequence. A doctrine that told an air group exactly how to coordinate with a hunter-killer team. And a torpedo whose brain was a tuning fork and a circuit. None of those things is glamorous alone. Together, they're destiny. If you've made it this far, you feel the pattern. Technology plus industry plus doctrine outmaneuvered courage plus craftsmanship plus tradition. That's not a moral judgment. It's a map, and it leads past 1945. After the war, surviving Japanese submariners toured American bases, sat in classrooms, and watched assembly lines that rolled like rivers. Some would later work in companies that taught the world a new definition of precision. Toyota, Sony, Honda. They learned a hard lesson at sea and carried it into factories and design studios. The masterpiece matters, but the system wins. Build what you can produce, improve what you can measure, integrate what you invent. In time, Japan's post-war submarines became superb, quiet, efficient, and, crucially, part of a system that could sustain excellence. But the ocean's verdict from 1941 to 1945 stands. The sea belongs to those who can hear it, see it, map it, and resupply the tools to keep listening. In that sense, the Night Hour story wasn't simply a battle. It was a demonstration. The moment a submarine dived and remained visible to ears, to math, to factories. The undersea war was decided. Here's the part one promised at the start. The strongest point saved for last. Some stories end with monuments and medals. This one ends with a sound. In a quiet archive, on two thin spools of wire, lives the last breath of a submarine that never knew how it was killed. Play the recording, and you will not hear heroism or cowardice. You will hear physics. You will hear industry. You will hear the future arriving early. That whisper is the handover note where the ocean changes owners. Not forever, but for as long as technology and production keep time with each other. If that thought chills you, it should. If it fascinates you, welcome aboard. If you want more deep dive stories like this, tales where invisible ideas reshape entire wars, hit like and subscribe now so you don't miss the next episode. And tell me in the comments, which single technology do you think truly flipped the undersea war? Sonobuoys, acoustic torpedoes, code breaking, or something else entirely? Drop your answer, argue your case, and suggest the next hidden turning point you want uncovered. Your comment might be the spark for our next mission. Picture the control room of a long-range boat at battle stations. Sweat running in cold lines, the trim pumps murmuring, the helmsman whispering corrections as the needle drifts. The captain orders, down angle 5, and the bow dips into a darkness that used to feel like safety. The diving officer counts off depth, 50, 80, 150. Then the first thump rolls down the hull like a fist on a door. The boat shudders, lights blink, steam wisps from a tired gasket. Silence returns, until the radio shack. Headphones pressed tight. Here's something new on a frequency nobody briefed. Faint, regular, like a heartbeat not your own. It is the ocean reporting you. That was the new battlefield. Not sightlines and silhouettes, but echoes and patterns. Above, a pilot lit his instrument panel in green, dialed across channels. Purple, orange, blue, and listened to a moving sound that spelled out a course change. He didn't chase the submarine. He shepherded a weapon that did. Doctrine decided who learned this first. Japan poured elite crews into missions tailored for warships and scouting for the fleet. It made sense. On paper, seek carriers, shadow task forces, strike high value, high prestige. The problem was arithmetic. A fleet that eats merchant shipping thrives. A fleet that hunts only warships starves while the enemy buys time. American submarines were told to do the ugly work every day. Go where cargo moves, cut it, and keep cutting. Ranges were long, opportunities constant, and the feedback immediate. A burning tanker is a message to a dozen more that never leave port. And when your tool breaks, fix it in the field. Early American patrol reports read like a bad joke. Torpedo hit, failed to explode, ran under target. Premature detonation. Careers were risked to prove the defects. Tests were staged in remote bays with live warheads against cliff faces. Loud, angry science. Solutions followed. Depth settings corrected, detonators redesigned, doctrine updated. Then the electric torpedo entered service. No wake, no white line of death to give away the shot. Then the acoustic airdropped hunter joined the hunt, listening through those floating ears. Each fix compounded the last. Each invention slotted into a system already scaled to multiply it. America's boats carried radar the way a hunter carries eyes. Always on, always sweeping. They had a computer, the target data computer, that turned bearing rate and angle on the bow into a firing solution faster than a human plot could keep up. Captains could snap to an attack while the target still believed it was alone. Meanwhile, in too many Japanese boats, the math lived in the navigator's head and on grease pencils, elegant but slow, precise but perilous when seconds are bullets. Intelligence closed the circle, codebreakers read schedules and routes. You don't need to be everywhere if you know where there will be tomorrow. Radar puts you in position. Sonar keeps you alive. Torpedoes close the account. And when something fails, when a set jams or a seal leaks, the logistics marshal steps forward with a crate that arrived yesterday and will arrive tomorrow. That is what doctrine looks like when industry breathes for it. Now imagine the first reports filtering back to Japanese submarine headquarters in 1944. Aircraft attacked after dive. Depth bombs fell with uncanny accuracy. Torpedo appeared to home on propeller noise. Enemy aircraft remained overhead for hours, as if guided. The words are calm on paper. They are not calm in the mind. Dive times are recalculated. Surfacing schedules shift to midnight plus shadows. Engineers paint sound-absorbing coatings on hulls and string demagnetization cables along the plates, but coatings do not confuse a buoy listening for a rhythm. Cables do not charm a homing head. The Sea of Japan felt safe the way a locked door feels safe. Until someone produces the right key. The key rang like a bell. A new frequency-modulated sonar traced shapes, not just contacts. Minds, once invisible teeth, became icons on a mental map, each chiming with a signature the crews nicknamed Hell's Bells. One by one, submarines slid through straits that planners had declared impassable. On maps, stamped secret. Inside, ships steamed along as if behind castle walls. In days, that illusion collapsed into smoke on the horizon and lifeboats in cold water. This is where the story tightens from technology to feeling. A captain listens to American radio traffic after intercepting a routine signal. It isn't the content that breaks him. It's the tone, ease, abundance, coordination across thousands of miles as if distance had been demoted from tyrant to errant. You can't outsneak that. You can't outbrave that. You can only outbuild it. And by 1944, the window for that answer had already closed. Factories matter because time matters. One submarine is a triumph. 10 delivered on schedule is a campaign. 100 with spares is a policy. American yards launch fleet boats like clock faces losing hands. Standard parts moved by rail, by truck, by barge, arriving in sequences planned months ahead. Sailors trained on simulators that matched the systems they would sail with. Every improvement, new radar, better bearings, refined torpedo gyros, slid into place with minimal friction. Japan's industry, battered by bombing, starved by blockade, and stretched by commitments, couldn't match that rhythm. Crews became curators of scarce replacements rather than customers of a pipeline. Even when Japanese engineering dazzled, the giant submarine carriers with hangars and catapults, the long-range cargo boats threading two oceans. The strategy they needed assumed an ocean that would let them pass unnoticed. By 1945, the ocean had opinions, and the human cost rose to the surface in cruel ways. The submarine branch, once a badge of elite status, turned into a sentence whispered behind closed doors. Training classes marched one by one into statistics. Shore leave goodbyes lengthened. Letters home narrowed to coded reassurances. The bravest men in the world can be beaten by a probability curve if every variable in that curve is drifting against them. Detection up, weapon. Reliability up, target availability down, resupply uncertain. Call it the mathematics of inevitability. If the enemy's find goes from sometimes to often, and his kill goes from coin flip to near certain, then your survive migrates toward zero no matter how skilled you are. After surrender, the surviving crews met their former shadows in daylight. They toured boats that had hunted them. They spun dials on radar sets that could find periscopes. They listened to recordings from sonobuoys, the actual, unblinking sound of submarines they had never met but understood intimately. They watched engineers disassemble captured giants with a methodical curiosity that said less enemy than problem solved. And then, in a last turn of the wheel, some of those giants were towed out and sent to the bottom deliberately, denied to other curious eyes. The message, even if unspoken, was blunt. We have learned what we need. This era is over. But history didn't end there. The lesson those crews carried home, system over spectacle, integration over improvisation, turned into factories that prized reliability and iteration. The masterpiece gave way to the production line, not as a surrender of art, but as its evolution. In a generation, Japanese shipyards and workshops were building machines that set global standards. When new submarines slid down new ways, they were quieter, smarter, and plugged into a support system built to keep them that way. Former foes ran exercises together. The students of defeat became partners in deterrence. Return with me, once more, to the sound that started this. Thin wire spools, labeled by hand, resting in an archive drawer. Press play. Hear the sea as an instrument. The pitch of propellers rising as a wounded boat strains. The sharp report of a weapon finding its mark. The long, grinding agony of a pressure hull yielding to physics. Then a hush that isn't quite silence. Because silence at sea is never absolute. Those spools are not relics of a single sinking. They are proof that the ocean, for a time, became audible to those who built the right tools to listen. So what, exactly, won the undersea war? Pick your candidate. The sonobuoy that turned water into a wiretap. The acoustic torpedo that gave hearing to steel. The radar that let hunters see in the dark. The codebreakers who stole tomorrow's schedules today. The factory that turned fixes into fleets. My answer is less romantic and more frightening. What won was combination. Not one invention, but the disciplined habit of folding each invention into a larger, repeatable system. If that unsettles you, it should. It means the deciding factor isn't always the bravest crew or the biggest ship. It's the quiet choreography behind them. If you want more stories where the real drama happens in labs, in factories, and in mines, where a bell's chime in a sonar room resets an empire's odds, tap like and subscribe right now so you don't miss what's next, and jump into the comments. If you could put yourself in one seat for a single hour in 1944, the pilot deploying a rainbow of listening buoys, the captain threading a minefield by chimes, the engineer tuning an acoustic seeker, or the codebreaker reading tomorrow, where would you sit and why? Your pick might decide our next mission. Slide closer to the chart table and look at the problem the way a navigator does. You've got a convoy lane labeled in pencil, a set of celestial fixes from last night, and a fire control party hungry for numbers. In the old world, you'd stalk until moonlight gave you a silhouette and the sea gave you a guess. In the new world, you build a firing solution from whispers. Radar pings at 20 miles announcing metal. Hydrophones scribbling bearing changes like a metronome. A compact computer, gears, cams, and dials, turning time into angles. The target is still over the horizon, but the math is already shaking hands with the torpedoes. That machine, the target data computer, made attack craft and mathematics into accomplices. Feed it bearing rate, target speed, angle on the bow. It returns lead angles and gyro settings faster than a human plot can grow old. It wasn't glamorous. It was relentless. Under stress, humans guess. Machines repeat. Repetition favors the side that can build the machine, maintain it, and train thousands to use it the same way every time. Now flip perspectives. In a Japanese control room, the attack is art. A captain's eye, a navigator's slide rule, the muscle memory of a crew that can trim a boat on a whisper. It's beautiful and time-consuming. Seconds stretch while a periscope feather betrays position. Every extra heartbeat is a gift to radar, to aircraft, to a destroyer whose sonar is already painting the water in cones. Excellence feels tight and perfect at the periscope. It feels slow and fatal on a sonobuoys headset. Doctrine turns these differences into destinies. One navy hunted troops of warships and protected its own fleets. The other hunted the economy that fed those fleets. One navy invested in a few outsized marvels. The other standardized 1,000 good-enough miracles. One navy handcrafted solutions. The other industrialized fixes. Courage was everywhere. Efficiency was not. Let's step ashore, just for a minute, to the factory floor where the ocean's future was poured like steel. Imagine an assembly line where a pressure hull section meets a bundle of conduits pre-cut to length, where a radar set rides a cart labeled with the hull number it will feed, where spare parts accumulate before anyone knows which boat will need them. The rhythm here is the secret weapon. A defect discovered on Patrol 7 is redesigned on a drafting bench on Tuesday, tested in a tank on Thursday, approved on Friday, and shows up in the next production batch before the month turns. That is how ideas become fleets. Back at sea, a hunter-killer group spins a web under night. An escort carrier hums, its deck lights dim. As torpedo bombers rise like owls, the pilots train for patterns. 5 buoys first in a fan, then 5 more in a bracket, then a final string down the predicted track. Each buoy pulls a microphone below the chop and starts talking. Purple reports a steady thrum. Orange picks up a faint course change. Blue goes quiet, wrong side of the wake. The aircraft doesn't guess. It tunes across a soundscape. When the time is right, the hatch opens, a weapon drops, and physics does the rest. From below, this feels like being read, like the sea itself has betrayed you. You order, all stop, to quiet the propellers, and the boat hangs in blackness while men hold their breath as if lungs make noise. The crew can feel the enemy above even when the sea is calm. There's a pressure in the air that isn't pressure at all. It's anticipation. Maybe the torpedo loses you. Maybe it doesn't. You don't control the maybe. That is terror. There were counters, of course, coatings meant to swallow sound, demagnetization loops meant to confuse minds, radar sets arriving late in the war to return eyes to the night. But counters must be more than clever. They must be common, reliable, and supplied. A single boat made slightly quieter does not tilt an ocean where the opponent has taught airplanes to hear. The minefields were supposed to be the trump card. Even a perfect hunter turns cautious when teeth fill the narrows. But that frequency-modulated sonar changed minds from myth to map. The characteristic chime. Crewmen joked about the bells of a church guiding them through the valley of death, became a soundtrack to improbable navigation. This wasn't daring for its own sake. It was technology closing a 200-mile detour into a 20-hour underwater transit. Strategy shifts when the impossible fits inside a patrol plan. Now listen for a different kind of sound. The murmur of intercepted conversation. In a radio room thick with cigarette smoke, a linguist translates a schedule that should have been private. There's no drama in his voice, only competence. Convoy departing Tuesday at 2200. A submarine captain hears that and knows where to lay his ambush. Multiply that by 100 rooms, 100 schedules, and the ocean's chaos starts to look suspiciously like order. For one side, numbers close in. In a peak year, American submarines notch kills so frequently that reports sound repetitive. Date, position, ship, tonnage, fate. Repetition here is not boredom. It's strangulation. Tankers vanish, or carriers vanish. Coastal steamers start hugging cliffs and creeping at night. Insurance becomes prayer. Meanwhile, Japanese submarine losses climb into a statistic nobody wants to recite. Boats that begin patrols do not return. Training classes turn into names etched on stones. families learn to interpret the delay of a letter. Officers who once wore their dolphins as a promise begin to wear them like a prophecy. The branch that started as a leap becomes a ledge. And yet, inside each boat, professionalism never became cowardice. Damage parties drilled. Torpedo rooms stayed immaculate even when the torpedoes themselves were few. Navigators plotted like artists even when the canvas kept shrinking. That is dignity. And acknowledging it doesn't change the outcome. It changes how we, in hindsight, talk about the people who lived inside the loss. Here is a hard truth wrapped in a simple image. Picture two hands. One is craftsmanship, steady, precise, capable of miracles on a good day. The other is a machine that multiplies the first hand by 1,000 on any day. In a duel, the craftsman can win. In a campaign, the machine does. If you want to see that duel turned into a teaching tool, go to the archives, on paper, in your mind, and look at those wire spools marked in pencil. They are not poetry. They are proof. A night in 1944 condensed into a handful of sounds. The last alive minutes of a submarine and the first mature minutes of a new way of war. The past rarely gives us artifacts that speak. These do. Now a final lens, legacy. Out of defeat came a philosophy. Build systems, not stunts. Post-war shipyards and factories learned to treat quality as a habit, not an aspiration. Submarines became quieter than the ocean itself, and the crews who once felt hunted helped design boats that would be harder to hear. Former enemies trained together because technology had made the stakes global. The only thing more dangerous than two rival sonar rooms is two rival sonar rooms that refuse to talk until it's too late. So, what lessons should we carry forward from steel hulls, chiming sonars, and rainbow buoys? That the sea favors whoever can transform it into data, and then turn data into decisions, and then manufacture that chain until it no longer breaks under combat's weight. Courage is the price of entry. Capacity is the price of victory. If you're still here, you're the kind of person who keeps a hand on the chart even when the room goes dark. Hit like and subscribe so this series can keep cutting into the hidden machinery of World War II. And tell me in the comments, if you had to choose one. Link in the chain to build first: detection, weapons, code-breaking, or production. Which would you invest in, and why? I'm reading every reply, and your answer could steer the next episode. Hold a sonobuoy in your mind. A slim canister with a wire throat and a patient ear, tossed from a wing. It splashes down, unfolds, and lowers a microphone into the cold. That's all. No drama, no hero shot. But multiply it by 10, tune each to a different channel, and you've sketched a cage the eye can't see. Pilots learn to throw color like painters. Purple first to fix the center, orange and blue to flank, red and yellow to seal the path. Then they simply listened and let geometry do what gunfire never could. Predict. From that prediction came a new tempo. Anti-submarine warfare stopped being a sprint and became a dance. Aircraft orbited, destroyers angled in, and the sea itself became a conveyor belt feeding targets to weapons designed to hear. Underwater, a captain with perfect instincts now played against an opponent that didn't need instincts at all, only patience and a radio. Zoom in on an escort carrier at midnight. The deck crew whispers, hands signal, an Avenger rolls forward, engine steady, never raising its voice. It leaps, banks, and slides into a pattern that's been briefed, practiced, and perfected. In the back, a radio operator wears the ocean like a second skin through his headphones. He's not hunting. He's curating. This buoy sings, that one hums, the next falls quiet, and a picture emerges with no lines drawn. When the torpedo goes, no one cheers. The weapon will tell them if it's right. Now back below, where fear learns nuance. All stop, by silence. But silence is never clean. Batteries fizz, bearings tick, hull plates flex with tiny complaints. Men learn to hold coughs like secrets. The helmsman's fingers ache from stillness. Someone thinks he hears a screw up there and then hates himself for believing in ghosts. Minutes stretch thin. Somewhere in the black, a seeker decides. The captain doesn't get to vote. Consider the difference that a single box of cams and gears makes. A target data computer isn't a weapon. It's a promise. Tell it the truth. Bearing rate, speed, angle. And it delivers angles that feed warheads with confidence instead of hope. The American approach made that promise on every boat, handled the maintenance, trained the hands, and kept the spares flowing. The Japanese approach put faith in expert crews solving fresh problems under pressure. One is a miracle under a deadline. The other is a routine with a kill rate. When Operation Barney pushed into the mine straits, the world's bravest cartographers were wearing headphones. The frequency-modulated sonar didn't just shout at obstacles. It rang with an unmistakable tone that crews nicknamed Hell's Bells. That chime turned a death field into a hallway. It didn't eliminate danger. It made danger legible. Once the mines became marks on an invisible chart, the calculus flipped. What had been labeled impassable became improbable but practical. And practical wins wars. Doctrine amplifies hardware. Japanese submarines, gorgeous and long-legged, were leashed to a mission that sought prestige targets. American submarines went where the payoffs were repetitive and brutal. Cargo lanes, tanker routes, coastal freighters. Warships can be replaced by will. Fuel cannot. Rice cannot. Or cannot. Sink those. And the grand battles never happen because the fleets grow hungry in port. This is how statistics become sentences. A peak year of submarine warfare reads like a drumbeat. One ship, then another, until harbors fill with vessels that choose not to sail at all. Meanwhile, losses among Japanese submarines climb to percentages that feel like typos until you meet the families. The patch that once meant elite starts to mean prepare your goodbyes. The courage never changes. The outcome does. Even technology Japan did field arrived late or too thinly to matter. Radar sets rolled out in small numbers when the skies were already crowded with enemies who saw. Farther, anti-aircraft mounts bristled on decks that couldn't defend against a buoy grid and a homing head. Sound-absorbing coats dulled echoes but didn't erase the rhythms that sonobuoys loved. Demagnetization loops baffled minds they never met. And in the attack itself, manual plotting dared fate every time the scope broke the surface. Interrogations after the war didn't produce theatrical confessions. They produced quiet sentences like, "We realized they could always find us." Not always, of course. War always leaves room for miracle and luck. But when sometimes becomes often, morale warps. Captains who once hunted by intuition started counting chances the way accountants count debt. The ocean had changed from a wilderness to an audited space. Step back again to the factories, because battles are footnotes to production. Picture railcars arriving at dawn with standardized panels. Crates of vacuum tubes already tested, Euro assemblies pre-calibrated, and wiring looms tagged for. Hull numbers not yet assigned. The foreman doesn't need to give a speech about patriotism. He needs to check a barcode. That's the speech. In that rhythm, a defect disappears in one batch and the fix appears in the next, and the sailors barely notice except that things start to work how they were designed. It's tempting to call the giant submarine aircraft carriers failures. That misses the point. They were brilliant answers to a question the ocean no longer allowed. Their hangars, range, and audacity would have mattered in a world where the deep was inscrutable. In the world of grids and bells and codebooks, they were orchestras performing in a room where the audience had already left. When surrender stripped away secrecy, the tour that followed felt like a museum visit and a post-mortem at once. Japanese officers touched equipment that had hunted them and recognized their own engineering in miniature inside it. The same love of precision, but married to an ecosystem of supply, training, and doctrine that made perfection common. Then came the final erasures, the scuttlings that kept certain boats from foreign study. Watching a masterpiece sent to the bottom by decision rather than battle told a last, quiet truth. The learning was complete. Legacy is where the war still breathes. The lessons filtered into design studios and assembly floors. Make quality repeatable, make upgrades painless, make feedback fast. In time, Japanese submarines reemerged as some of the best in the world. Whisper quiet, superbly built, and supported by institutions that had learned the price of improvisation. Former enemies rehearsed together because the ocean doesn't care who salutes which flag. It cares who can hear and who can be heard. So hold the wars. Essence in 3 sounds. First, the soft splash of a cylinder becoming an ear. Second, the bell-like chime of a sonar telling a crew where not to die. Third, the long, metallic groan of a pressure hull surrendering to depth. If you arrange those in order, You have a story. Invention, navigation, consequence. And here is the closing lesson, sharpened to a point you can carry in your pocket. Bravery sets the stage. Technology writes the script. Industry ensures the show goes on night after night, until the other side can't afford a ticket. The undersea war wasn't won by a single genius or a lone hero. It was won by a habit. Integrate, iterate, and scale. If that view of history changes how you hear waves, good. That means you're listening the way the war was won, by turning water into information and information into control. If this dive into the silent machinery of victory ignited something, tap like and subscribe so you're here for the next chapter. Then weigh in below. Which moment in this story hit you hardest? The invisible cage of sonobuoys, the bells in the minefields, or the quiet arithmetic of factories? Tell me why. Your comment decides which thread we pull next. Picture a schoolroom of young officers learning to hear, not lectures, listening. An instructor plays a record of ocean noise. Wind hiss, wave slap, distant screw thrum, the faint, irregular clatter that means machinery is unhappy somewhere below. He drops a needle on another groove. Now a steady, three-bladed cadence with a tiny wobble every fourth beat. That, he says, is not the sea. That is a ship telling you its propeller is chipped. The lesson isn't romance. It's pattern recognition, drilled until instinct becomes instrument. When those officers fly, they won't look first. They'll listen. This was the real revolution. Not the gadget, but the habit. Train humans to trust what sensors say, then build doctrine around that trust. A pilot no longer needed heroics. He needed discipline. A destroyer captain no longer searched for periscopes. He kept his ship inside a geometry defined by sound. A submariner who once relied on darkness learned that darkness now belonged to whoever decoded it more completely. In steel corridors far from any shore, crews felt time change shape. Patrols lengthened not because of distance, but because of waiting. The worst hours came after a dive forced by radar. Engines quiet, boat hovering, every man listening for fate with his teeth. The petty officer of the watch stared at a depth gauge that moved like a second hand. The cook, who had nothing to cook, counted bolts along a bulkhead and convinced himself the count added to luck. Somewhere above, an airplane orbited without fatigue. Its fuel had a schedule, but its ears did not. Doctrine did something else cruel and efficient. It taught one side to accept incomplete victories because the arithmetic of repetition was on their side. Sink a tanker here, cripple a freighter there, frighten 5 more into harbor, and whole factories would miss a week of raw material. The other side needed triumphs that mattered visibly. Warships. A fire, headlines, glory. They got some. They needed more than some. In the torpedo rooms where everything smelled faintly of oil and hope, sailors learned to trust metal again. The early shame of duds had been burned out by field tests, arguments turned into engineering changes, and the stubbornness of captains who put their careers on the line to demand fixes. When the redesigned detonators and corrected depth keepers flowed through the fleet, confidence returned with a vengeance. A boat could fire a spread and expect physics to do its part. Confidence is a weapon, too. Listen to the counterarguments that rose then and now. But Japanese submarines were brilliant machines. True. But they had extraordinary range. Also true. But they achieved daring feats early in the war. Undeniable. These things are not lies. They are incomplete. In conflicts that last years, excellence must be repeatable under stress, manufacturable at scale, reparable under fire, and teachable to thousands who weren't top of their class. The war at sea punished anything less. There were moments of almost a raid on a canal that could have shaken the hemisphere. Almost a strike on a harbor that would have echoed in newsreels. Almost a supply mission that might have been a front line's hunger back toward hope. Each almost collided with the same layered wall. Radar that saw at night. Hydrophones that mapped your heartbeat. Codebreakers who booked your arrival before you left, and an acoustic seeker with no eyes that still could not miss. Heroism met coverage. When 9 submarines slid through a mine straight guided by a sonar chime. They didn't simply open a door. They changed the building's floor plan. Inside the supposedly safe sea, ships steamed as if under a glass dome. In 2 weeks, the dome shattered. Survivors who made it to shore carried more than wounds. They carried a new certainty that the enemy had learned to ignore. Impossible. That certainty is its own weapon because it moves decisions upstream. Convoys are canceled. Routes are abandoned. Factories idle before the torpedo ever leaves its tube. Shift again to the decoding rooms, because history hides its levers in quiet places. The messages read aloud were not dramatic. Numbers, dates, designations. Yet they bent ships like wind bends grass. Schedules read days in advance let submarines arrive early to places where luck used to rule. Combine that with a radar scope's green sweep and a TDC's humming certainty, and you have a kill chain that begins as ink and ends as tonnage lost. If you want to know what modern war sounds like, it sounds like paper turning and a bearing knob clicking to a stop. What did defeat feel like for men who did everything right on the day? It felt like being late to a language. They had trained to read wakes, judge silhouettes at moonrise, plot intercepts by hand, and insinuate themselves into the blind spots of escorted convoys. Then they discovered that the enemy had taught airplanes to hear, taught ships to see beyond weather, taught machines to solve trigonometry while a periscope lens still shed water. Skill still mattered, but skill alone was now poverty. There were acts of defiance that don't read as tactics, but deserve telling as measures of character. Damage control parties who learned to replace a gasket by touch. Signalmen who could read a blinking lamp through spray with freezing hands. Torpedo men who nursed temperamental fish into reliability with ritual and pride. When the ocean closed around them, those men did not become smaller. The contest grew larger than any man could be. After the surrender, the most eloquent conversations happened without interpreters. Engineers, sailors, and officers stared at each other's machines and saw reflections. A love of precision, a respect for craft, the quiet arrogance of people who expect things to work because they have made them work under pressure. Then they saw the difference. One side had turned that pride into a process that never depended on any single genius, that humbled everyone in the room who valued results over stories. In the archives, the wire spools endure. They look fragile because they are thin, dull, easily dismissed. Put them on a player and the past stops being a paragraph and becomes a pressure wave. The first rumble is a boat alive and unaware. The sharp report is a weapon arriving. The long, grinding crescendo is metal meeting math. Then the tape hisses a kind of winter. If you listen closely, you may hear your own breath change. That's not nostalgia. That's comprehension. What do we, watchers from peacetime, owe to those sounds? Not worship, not cynicism, clarity. Wars do not resolve into single moments, but into systems reaching critical mass. In the undersea war, that mass was formed by 1,000 unglamorous successes attached end to end, an antenna that held its tuning in salt air, a shipping schedule read on a Tuesday, a factory foreman who hit his quota quietly, a young radio man who learned to trust a hum more than a hunch. Stack those, and you inherit oceans. If you've traveled this far with me, you've done what those wartime crews did. You followed a thread across darkness until it made a picture. Keep pulling. Like this video so more people find these hard, hidden turning points. Subscribe so you don't miss the next mission. And drop your thoughts below. If you could remove just one link from the chain, a sensor, a weapon, a doctrine, or the factory cadence, which one? And how do you think the war at sea changes? I'm reading every comment, and the most compelling take might captain our next deep dive. Imagine the ocean as a ledger and every ship as an entry. Early in the war, the columns looked balanced. Losses, yes, but traffic still flowed. Then a quiet change in accounting began. Submarines armed with better eyes and sharper ears started crossing out lines faster than shipyards could add them back. Tankers went missing or carriers vanished, and freighters that once steamed boldly began hugging coastlines like the edges of a torn map. By the time anyone tried to audit the damage, the ledger had already drifted into red ink and empty harbors. On patrol after patrol, the rhythm settled into something almost ritual. Radar contact at long range, closing in darkness. A swift dive as searchlights probed the horizon. Then the new grammar took over. Bearings whispered through hydrophones. Numbers spun into the target computer. Torpedoes slid into water without a flash. A minute later, a shudder far away. Another line erased from the ledger. Another week added to a factory's delay. It wasn't a single knockout. It was the slow, guaranteed victory of repetition. Meanwhile, Japanese submariners wrote their own rituals against a shrinking future. The night orders grew stricter. Surfacing times shortened. Batteries were nursed like fragile hearts. Deck guns, once symbols of swagger, were manned mainly as a gesture against the sky. Crews layered their boats with small protections. New paint meant to drink sound. Demagnetization cables looped like talismans. Some helped at the margins. None altered the math inside the enemy's headsets. Think about the asymmetry in confidence. In one torpedo room, sailors were the memory of duds like a scar that healed. Fixes arrived, tests proved them, and the next patrol felt like a promise kept. In another, even reliable weapons were rationed by scarcity. Every shot became both a tactic and an expenditure. The first mindset hunts freely. The second hunts carefully. War rarely rewards careful when the opponent has made free reliable. Back to the minefields, because that moment matters. The straits were a locked door by design. For rows of teeth, gaps measured by depth rather than distance. Then came the chime. Crewmen described it later in simple words, a bell in the dark. Because what else do you call a sound that turns fear into a map? Imagine tracing a path through black water by notes, steering not for what you see, but for what you refuse to hear. When those submarines surfaced inside waters labeled safe by decree, they didn't just sink ships. They erased confidence, first on bridges, then in war rooms, then in the assumptions a nation made about itself. The hardest part to grasp from peacetime is how quickly technology changes feelings. Before sonobuoys, a dive felt like closing a door. After sonobuoys, a dive felt like stepping behind glass. Before radar, night promised concealment. After radar, night belonged to whoever carried the screen. Before codebreaking matured, movement across the ocean was a conversation between chance and skill. Afterward, it was an appointment. Those are emotional shifts as much as tactical ones, and morale lives or dies in those spaces. There's a story, told quietly, of a captain who realized the war's verdict, not during a battle, but during a routine listen. He intercepted enemy radio traffic and heard ease, jokes, efficient handoffs, coordinates tossed between units spread over half a planet as if they were in the same room. He understood that he wasn't fighting just a navy. He was fighting a culture of coordination powered by factories and research labs that synchronized like a metronome. He finished his patrol because duty demanded it, but certainty had already arrived. Let's stand, for a moment, in the shadow of the largest submarines ever built to that date, boats that could carry aircraft in their bellies and cross oceans without pausing. On paper, they were the future. On water, in the age of ears and bells and grids, they were targets in waiting. Their very size gave them away. On sonar, on radar, in the patterns of sound that operators learned to identify as if meeting an old acquaintance on a crowded street. They were magnificent solutions to a problem that technology had already moved. After surrender, one last act of choreography closed the curtain. Teams of engineers and sailors walked the length of captured giants, tracing wiring, measuring compartments, appreciating craft, and confirming that they had nothing left to learn that would change tomorrow's boats. Then tugs towed some of those masterpieces to deep water and ended their stories with deliberate detonations. Not cruelty, finality. The lesson had been harvested. The ocean was given back its scrapbooks. What survived into the next era were not the silhouettes, but the habits. Systems thinking, fast feedback, training that taught the ear before the eye. Supply chains designed so that no single failure starved a fleet. In time, the nation that lost beneath the waves rebuilt with those lessons in its hands. Factories tuned to quality, ships tuned to silence, crews tuned to doctrine that favored repeatable excellence over daring alone. Former enemies met as instructors and students, then as peers. Because the sea forgives slowly but demands competence every day. Now, hold. 3 images as we near our final point. The first, an aircraft crew dropping a rainbow of listening posts into a black ocean and then flying in patient circles, constructing a picture from sound. The second, a submarine crew steering by chimes through a corridor of minds, their nerves held steady by training that turned terror into technique. The third, A factory floor where a flawed detonator is redesigned on Wednesday and shipped in quantity on Friday, so that a captain a month from now never knows there was once a problem. Connect those images and you have the winning machine. What? Then, flip the undersea war. Not one spark. A chain. Detection that worked in any weather. Weapons that punished any movement. Computation that removed human delay. Intelligence that replaced luck. And production that made all of it ordinary. The ocean, once an arena for individual brilliance, became a network. Those who mastered the network mastered the sea. As we close, return to the wire spools. The ghosts that proved the moment technology took the lead. Press play and listen to the shape of inevitability. A throb, a search, a choice, an end. That sound is not just a death, it's a demonstration. The future, arriving a few minutes at a time, until no minutes were left. If this journey through the silent gears of victory hooked you, hit like and subscribe so you're aboard when we dive into the next hidden turning point. And jump into the comments. If you could travel back and change one decision, doctrine, investment, training, or target selection, which one alters the war beneath the waves most, and why? Make your case. The most thoughtful argument will steer our next episode. Walk with me into a plotting room where pencils scratch faster than footsteps. The air smells of graphite and coffee, and the map of an ocean is pinned under rulers and string. A lieutenant traces arcs where convoys should be, then overlays a quieter map, the one made of signals. A call sign heard yesterday, a schedule decrypted last week, a tanker route that never changes because geography can't. When a submarine slips its moorings that night, it isn't hunting mystery. It's answering an invitation written in numbers. Out on the water, the rhythm is almost comforting because it repeats. Radar sweeps reveal a smear that resolves into a contact, bearing steady. Range decreasing. Engines ease to keep the noise down. The captain raises the scope for one breath, a thin feather of wake, and ducks below. The target data computer hums like a well-fed animal, digesting angles and spitting out truth. The boat turns to the firing course with a confidence born not of bravado but of routine. Somewhere far ahead, a ship's crew laughs at a joke they won't remember. The ocean keeps both moments and then ties them together. Shift to a different steel room where routine has curdled into dread. Fresh paint meant to swallow sound dulls to a scuffed sheen. A new radar set sits like a promise that arrived late to the party. The captain reads night orders that once granted freedom but now feel like survival rules. Surface. Only in the deepest dark. Stay no longer than batteries demand. Trust the horizon only until a sweep says otherwise. Men who once rose to deck for wind and stars learn to love stale air because it is safer. Technology compresses distance, and when distance collapses, time follows. That's why a hunter-killer group works. The carrier's aircraft expand the fleet's touch. The buoys extend the aircraft's hearing. The homing head extends the pilot's hand. Each link removes a chance for the hunted to be alone. Each removes minutes that used to belong to the submarine. Minutes are oxygen. Once the enemy owns them, breath turns short. There is a moment all crews know, the heartbeat when doubt and duty collide. A torpedo room stands by. The captain hesitates for half a second because the sea has tricks and pride makes fools. And then training cuts the hesitation in half again. Fire. Tubes cough. The boat rocks. Silence. The men listen for the far, dull thud that means the idea became metal and the metal found purpose. When it comes, the cheer is brief and soft. A rule as much as a feeling. Noise is risk. Professionalism is quiet. If we grant technology its due, we must grant psychology equal billing. Consider the weight of repetition when you are the hunted. Reports arrive from other boats, contacted after dive. Hedgehogs and charges falling in patterns that feel personal. A noise-seeking weapon curving into its work. You plan counters that live on the margins. Cut speed to a crawl. Shift depth. Hold still so long the crew learns the taste of fear. Some tricks help once. Fewer help twice. The ocean becomes a room with mirrors that all face outward. Walk down a pier into a warehouse far from battle, and you will understand why mirrors appeared. Crates labeled by hull number. Spare vacuum tubes slotted in foam. Bearings pre-lubed and packed with instructions printed large enough for a tired chief to read under a red light. A redesign stamped approved on Monday is in a crate by Thursday and aboard by the next sailing. No one calls this heroism. They call it schedule. Schedules eat wars. Numbers finish what sensors start. A fleet that begins with 6 million tons of merchant shipping and ends the war with a third of that cannot sustain grand plans. Mines go unfed. Armies go undersupplied. Cities grow hungry. Strategy bends to arithmetic even when generals refuse to. Meanwhile, submarine production that replaces losses in months teaches crews that tomorrow exists. Hope may not be a metric, but you can count the things that manufacture it. There were captains who still found ways to bite back, shots taken at long odds that paid, raids that rattled nerves and headlines. But the ocean's new grammar punished irregular verbs. An occasional spectacular success could not offset a daily grind of attrition applied with system-level precision. You can admire daring and still know what wins. In the narrow straits where minds write the law, that law turned negotiable. The instant a sonar began to sing in tones rather than buzzes, the crews who threaded those fields didn't grow reckless. They grew literate. Each chime was a character. Each gap was punctuation. Steer by syntax, and you exit into a sea the enemy has declared private. Sink ships there, and you do more than destroy metal. You amputate certainty at the nerve. When defeat came, some men chose silence forever rather than surrender. Others stepped across gangways into enemy boats with eyes that were both curious and tired. What they saw offended no engineer's pride. Tidy spaces, clever mechanisms, pragmatic choices. What they saw that cut deeper was the absence of improvisation where they expected it. Things worked because they were made to work in large numbers, not because a genius could coax a temperamental piece into performance on the day. Post-war, the most meaningful revenge was competence. Build factories that do not miss. Teach quality as muscle memory. Design submarines that teach the ocean to hear less. Train crews to treat procedures as the skeleton of courage. In that world, former foes become tutors. The circle doesn't close by forgetting. It closes by absorbing the lesson so fully that it becomes instinct. Hold, once more, the three-part cadence that defined the turning. Detect, decide, deliver. Detect without weather or light. Decide without delay or ego. Deliver without warning or waste. That cadence hums beneath this entire story. When one side mastered it as a habit, the outcome followed like tide after moonrise. And if you want the whole war in one small artifact, picture a wire spool sitting quietly in an archive drawer. Nothing about it looks dramatic. Wind it, press play, and the sea speaks. The steady life sound of a boat, the approach you cannot see, the strike you cannot escape, the long decline into physics. It is proof that the future doesn't always arrive as thunder. Sometimes it arrives as a better microphone. If this kind of deep-cut history keeps you leaning forward, hit like and subscribe so you're on board for the next dive. Then tell me below, if you had to bet the outcome of an ocean on one discipline, engineering, training, intelligence, or logistics, which one? Do you build first, and how do you defend that choice? The best arguments steer where we go next. Think about exhaustion, the kind that makes numbers swim. On the 10th week of a patrol, even veterans start to dream in bearings. A helmsman wakes convinced he can feel a change in wake angle through the deck plates. The sonar operator carries a phantom hum into the mess and sets his cup down to the rhythm of a three-bladed screw he hasn't heard in hours. Fatigue used to be a tactical ally. A tired enemy makes mistakes, but when your opponent has taught aircraft to hear and destroyers to triangulate and factories to repair, fatigue becomes your private enemy. You can outlast a ship. You cannot outlast a system. Consider the tiny inventions that never make headlines yet change outcomes. A better vacuum tube that holds calibration over salt-stung nights. A shock mount that keeps a radar set aligned through a pounding sea. A new training tape that teaches operators to separate cavitation from wave slap in marginal conditions. None of these wins a war by itself. All of them make sure the tools you count on behave like instruments, not moods. Multiply that by 1,000, and a navy stops gambling. Now put two captains side by side at midnight. One American, one Japanese, each with a plan. The American captain rides a web, code breaking that placed him on the right meridian, radar granting a first sight. a target computer cutting the delay from observation to solution. Reliable torpedoes closing the account. The Japanese captain rides. Excellence. Long range on minimal fuel. A crew that trims to the ounce. A periscope discipline that would impress a painting restorer. If the ocean were still a mystery, excellence might win. In an ocean that has been turned into data, the web does. From shore, the war appears as dots on maps and arrows shifting with seasonal winds. Aboard ship, it's the smell of paint and oil, the throb of engines at exactly the right RPM, the ritual of opening a torpedo tube door and waiting for the ocean's breath to even out. In the air, its headset dense on hair and the click of a frequency knob from purple to orange to blue. In the decoding room, it's the rattle of typewriters and the smooth, unremarkable confidence of a voice reading a schedule that will unmake steel 7 days hence. None of those rooms looks like a painting. All of them together write history that paintings can only suggest. We should talk about courage, because technology sometimes hides it. The radio man who keeps copying. While the boat is hammered, knowing that one number might deliver a convoy to a friend. The pilot who circles 2 minutes longer than fuel doctrine recommends because the pattern is not complete and the picture not yet clear. The machinist who catches a bearings complaint early and prevents a catastrophic silence at depth. The cook who keeps men sane with rituals of heat and salt and small kindness on nights when the ocean sounds hungry. Machines matter. People make them matter. If you've ever stood in a museum beside a submarine's pressure hull and put your palm on riveted steel, you felt the promise and the limit in one touch. Steel keeps water out until it doesn't. Radios sing until static and damage make them cough. Sonar reads until biology mimics machinery and tricks an ear. That's why doctrine is not an accessory. It's the guardrail. Detect, decide, deliver is a simple cadence. But simplicity is a luxury bought by complexity elsewhere. Logistics nodes, training syllabi, test ranges, spare parts ledgers. The side that pays that bill consistently gets simplicity in the fight. As the blockade tightened, habits changed on shore. Coal piles thinned. Freight schedules slipped from tidy columns into apologetic blank spaces. Factories prioritized repairs over innovation because repairs kept the lights on. Naval planners who once played chess with fleets began playing triage with tonnage. In that environment, even a perfectly executed submarine patrol that sank a combatant felt like pulling one stone from a collapsing wall. Meanwhile, every tanker that burned was a missing week of flight operations, a canceled training sortie, a convoy postponed. The machinery of victory and defeat runs on fuel before it runs on glory. Return to the minefields for one more turn, because their lesson reaches beyond one war. The straits existed as a belief as much as a barrier. Here, technology gives way to geometry. Frequency-modulated sonar didn't merely find a path. It invalidated a category of assumption. When any tool turns impossible into procedural, strategy must update or fail. That's a rule with a long half-life. It governed then, and it governs now, whether in water, air, space, or code. In the last months, a strange inversion took hold. The hunters struggled to find targets large enough to justify shots, because the ledger had been drained. Submarines prowled coastlines like wolves over empty snow. It's a grim kind of success when you're most. Frequent contact is absence, but absence is also a message. The system worked so well that the enemy's options fell to zero. The end did not arrive as a single spectacular battle at sea. It arrived as a silence in shipping lanes that used to hum. Let's end where we began, with sound. Press your ear to the memory of that wire spool in the archive. Hear the way the ocean carries truth to those prepared to understand it. The throb of engines is ambition. The lattice of buoys is comprehension. The curving torpedo is consequence. The long groan is physics reminding steel that intentions do not bend water. Those minutes are more than a death. They are a demonstration that when invention is harnessed to production and disciplined by doctrine, the shape of war changes faster than tradition can keep up. So here's the final charge I promised to save for the end. The undersea war was not decided by who loved the ocean more, or who sailed more bravely, or who built the single most astonishing machine. It was decided by who turned knowledge into habit, and habit into scale, and scale into certainty. That's the lesson that outlived the ships and the men and the flags. Control the chain from listening to making to using, and you will control the water until someone listens better. If this closing struck you, if the image of a rainbow of listening posts fencing the night, or the bells in the minefields, or the ledger in red made you see World War II's oceans with new eyes, tap like and subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive. Then join the crew in the comments. In today's world, where do you think the next sonobuoy moment will happen? Under the sea, in orbit, in cyberspace, or somewhere we haven't learned to listen yet? Make your case. I'll be reading every argument, and the sharpest one sets our next course. Picture two briefings happening at the same hour on opposite sides of an ocean. In one, the room is bright and crowded with checklists. A junior officer briefs meteorology. Another reads the day's intelligence poll. A radar tech runs through maintenance status with the bored confidence of someone whose set simply works. The skipper asks two questions, nods, and the plan snaps into place like a lid. In the other, the room is dim and reverent. Charts on rollers, a compass rose worn smooth by fingertips. The captain talks through an approach that depends on moon phase, haze, and instinct. The crew is superb. No one doubts that. But the plan carries too many ifs. If the radar on the other side is not watching this sector, if the aircraft are grounded by weather, if the convoy commander is cautious but not clever, when an operation begins with hope clauses, the ocean will collect the interest. Now narrow down to a single moment you can almost touch. A radio man tuning through static and stumbling onto an enemy voice passing coordinates in a tone that sounds like a grocery list. That voice isn't brave or cruel. It is casual. Casual is what superiority feels like from the inside. Competence so normal that it never raises its voice. Hearing it from the outside can break your heart. Aboard the Hunters, casual doesn't mean careless. It means procedures bitten into muscle. Sonar operators annotate sound like court stenographers, marking time stamps, noting the change in blade count, flagging the sudden clean gap that means a submarine has stopped her screws and is holding her breath. Pilots report buoy status without flare, purple live, orange live, red weak, blue masked by chop. And the controller up on the carrier turns those short sentences into a moving box around a target that cannot see the lines. On the hunted side, calculation turns into superstition because the differences matter and you can't control them all. Men learn to step around a certain deck plate because it squeaks in a bad key. A chief swears a dab of grease on a hatch hinge changes the echo back to the aircraft above. Someone decides long socks make a difference because on the last patrol the men with cold ankles were in the compartment that flooded. None of these things should matter. In a war where the enemy has taught the sky to listen, none of them do. But no one tells superstition to. Stand down when fear needs a job. Pause with me at a chart of shipping. Each route is a sentence. Each port, a clause. Each tanker, punctuation. Start deleting commas and the paragraph stumbles. Remove the verbs, fuel, or, grain, and meaning collapses. That's what submarine warfare did in its mature phase. It turned an enemy's grammar into fragments. When you cannot complete a sentence, you cannot complete a strategy. There is an old saying that amateurs talk tactics and professionals talk logistics. In this story, the professionals talked logistics and then engineered tactics to accelerate logistics verdict. A single torpedo is a tactic. A radar set that works in rain, fog, and night is a tactic. A sonobuoy pattern that makes geometry out of black water is a tactic, but crates labeled and delivered on time. That's logistics. The only reason the tactics stayed golden was because the crates never stopped arriving. Shift again to the minefields, the scene that refuses to loosen its grip because it explains too much. Imagine a pilot whale moving through kelp with slow, deliberate grace. That was how those boats moved through the straits. Not rushing, not daring fate, but reading. Hell's bells chimed again and again, a count of danger that became a measure of safety. Mines had always been the sea's claim that technology must kneel at physics. Frequency-modulated sonar replied, "We can negotiate." And the recordings, the wire spools that became this story's talismans. Think about how fragile they are. Wire thinner than a pencil lead, wound around a hub that could fit in your palm. carrying everything important about a night. The voices of the men are absent. The sea's voice is all you get. That is fitting. What decided that night didn't care about language. It cared about wavelengths. When surrender landed like a weight, the last acts were personal. A proud officer stepped into an enemy control room and ran his hand over a fire control computer that did in seconds what he had trained years to do in his head. A machinist peered into a radar cabinet and recognized the elegance of obvious choices. Modular racks, labeled harnesses, fasteners that a tired hand could reach. A young sailor saw lockers full of spares and felt a complicated envy, the kind that respects, aches, and resolves to learn. Learning is the hinge on which this story swings into the future. Post-war, the defeated did not throw away their craft. They systematized it. Quality circles. Statistical control, designed for manufacturability. These are not buzzwords in this context. They are war lessons with the serial numbers filed off. Submarines built in later decades wore those lessons in their silence and their reliability. And some of the men who had once hidden from sonobuoys now stood in classrooms teaching why you must never let a single genius be the only bridge between invention and the fleet. One more scene at sea before we close. The hunter's circle, patient and unhurried. The last buoy in the pattern croaks to life with a clean, strong tone. The pilot doesn't feel triumph. He feels completion. Below, the hunted boat knows it has been fixed on a map it cannot see. The captain issues orders that are both correct and insufficient. Rig for silent running. Hold depth. Hands to quiet. The torpedo's seeker, deaf to courage and calm, makes its last adjustment. The ocean narrows to a point. When we talk about war, we reach for words like valor, honor, sacrifice. They belong here, but so do words like process, instrument, interval. The truth of this campaign is that the second set shaped the field on which the first set could act. The bitter edge is that good men died on both sides not because they lacked the first set, but because one side mastered the second. So if you want to leave with one idea that keeps its clarity even when memories blur, take this. The sea belongs, for a time, to those who can turn it into information and then turn that information into habits scaled by factories and upheld by training. Every other virtue rides along on that current. If this chapter sharpened your sense of how invisible tools moved visible outcomes, tap like and subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive. Then jump into the comments and argue this with me. Is there any single decision, doctrine, design, or production that, if reversed, could have given the undersea war a different ending? Pick one, make your case, and I'll feature the best arguments in the next episode. Walk into a midnight maintenance bay where victory smells like hot solder. A technician with grease under his nails leans into a radar rack and replaces a vacuum tube by touch, not heroism. He snaps the panel shut, scratches the hull number into a log, and moves to the next set with the boredom of competence. That boredom is the point. When equipment works so predictably that fixing it feels unremarkable, tactics tighten, risk thins, and luck is forced to earn every inch it gets. Across the ocean, a machinist's mate in a long-range boat nurses bearings with the tenderness of a violin maker. He can coax another 100 hours out of parts that should have retired, and on most seas in most wars that would be enough. But he cannot conjure sonobuoys out of air, radar out of fog, or a factory's river out of rocks. He can save a machine. He cannot save a campaign alone. Follow a single kill chain from beginning to end and see how small choices become fate. A code clerk yawns, makes one transcription error, and corrects it before anyone notices. The corrected line gives a convoy's departure 3 hours earlier than expected. A controller moves a patrol line 20 miles and instructs 2 boats to shift stations by a hair. One submarine's radar catches a contact at the new edge of the screen, where it wouldn't have been yesterday. A pilot, briefed for contingency, lifts off to seed a pattern because doctrine says, always paint the water before you gamble. The buoys fall, the box closes, the acoustic seeker listens, and a ship that left harbor on schedule dies on schedule. Nothing spectacular at any step. Everything decisive in the aggregate. Now set a clock on the hunted. The first minute after diving is relief. The second is procedure. The third is imagination starting to chew. By the 10th, the boat is quiet enough to hear the hull tick as pressure climbs. By the 20th, tiny noises become characters with personalities. That groan? Nuisance, not danger. That rattle? Familiar. Ignore it. That faint, regular hum? Not ours. Not ours. A weapon's patience is inhuman. It never tires. It never wonders if it misheard. It simply updates until geometry and sound agree, and then it ends the argument. Courage doesn't vanish in this environment. It resists in different shapes. A skipper choosing to surface for 60 measured seconds in the darkest slice of night, trading risk for battery life with a gambler's calm. A sonar operator owning his own fallibility and asking for a second set of ears because certainty matters more than pride. A pilot breaking off a tempting attack because the pattern isn't complete and doctrine says incomplete pictures kill friendly ships. All of that is bravery, just without the music. The ledger of shipping takes on a moral weight by the end. It's not just tonnage sunk. It's weeks of light in a city, days of training fuel for an air wing, hours of power for a factory that machines wings and pistons and dreams. When that ledger turns red, strategies bend toward the color. You can see it in the way routes hug coastlines and convoys shrink and departures slip by days into apologetic ellipses. The sea stops being a highway and becomes a test you must pass to eat. If you're wondering where genius fits in a system that prizes routine, it's here. Design genius that assumes fallibility, builds for it, and then teaches ordinary people to achieve extraordinary reliability. The target data computer did not remove the captain. It gave him a partner that never flinched. The sonobuoy did not replace the hunter's nose. It extended it beyond weather and light. The factory did not make sailors less important. It made their trust in their tools rational. There's a quiet mercy in honest comparisons, too. The giant submarine carriers were not foolish. They were misallocated to a world already shifting under their keels. Their range, their hangars, their audacity would have redefined campaign maps a decade earlier. In an ocean netted by ears and radar and code, their arcs became signatures. It isn't that they were unworthy. It's that the ocean they were built for had expired. Stand once more on a carrier deck. The wind beats at your clothes. The ships around you are blacked out to knife-edge outlines. The flight deck crew talks with hands. An Avenger claws off the deck and folds into the dark. Inside, the radio operator's headphones press deep. He rides frequencies like a musician finding a key. Purple buoy talks clean. Orange agrees. Red is masked by white caps. Blue suddenly brightens. There, a change. No hero lines. No shouted triumphs. Just clipped confirmations building a cage whose bars are invisible and absolute. The pilot drops the seeker. The circle widens to wait. A minute later, there's a sound in the headsets like a door slamming underwater. No one cheers. They tick a box and move to the next task because that's how systems digest victory without getting drunk on it. The hunted learn a different discipline. They practice stillness until it becomes art. They rehearse damage control until it becomes instinct. They write letters as if the paper could carry some of their weight away. They believe small rituals matter because rituals give shape to hours that would otherwise dissolve. This is human, and it is noble, and it deserves telling alongside the numbers, because the numbers don't annul the people. They explain the pressure that ground them down. There is a question that haunts every war story worth the telling. What should have been different? Doctrine? Targets? Investment? Training? If you reverse any single one, the undersea war still tilts toward the side that fused invention to production to procedure faster. That's not fatalism. It's a call to precision in planning. If you want a different outcome, you must change not one gear, but the habit that couples gears and multiplies their torque. Listen to the last months again, when hunters sometimes found only empty water where convoys had been. Emptiness can feel like failure when you've trained for contact, but emptiness is also a verdict. A shipping lane gone quiet means factories counting the days until they run out of or in oil and patience. A submarine returning light on torpedoes not because it couldn't find targets, but because targets were too small to waste the last shots, is a dark kind of success. It says the system reached beyond combat and began editing the enemy's options. After the flags came down and the formal words were spoken, the most important transfer ceremony didn't need a stage. It happened. When men who had been enemies became students and teachers. On both sides, some tasted bitterness. On both sides, most tasted relief and the relief's companion, curiosity. How did you make this reliable? Why did you choose this layout? What did your training stress when ours stressed something else? The answers became peacetime machines that outlasted the hull numbers and the war stories. Bring the whole thing down to a single, portable shape before we close. Picture a triangle with 3 words on its corners. Listen, learn, leverage. Listen means sensors that make darkness optional. Learn means doctrine that updates as fast as reality changes. Leverage means factories and supply chains that scale what works and retire what doesn't. If you keep that triangle stable, the ocean tilts toward you. If any corner fails, the sea takes back its neutrality and you pay in ships and lives and time. Now, for the last memory I'll ask you to carry. In a quiet archive, far from salt and wind, a thin wire spool waits. When you play it, you aren't just overhearing a death. You're hearing a demonstration. A submarine believed in darkness. A system believed in sound. Darkness blinked. Sound didn't. The end followed. Not because men lacked courage, but because one side turned courage into a repeatable method and fed that method until it became ordinary. If this journey sharpened your sense of how invisible tools drove visible outcomes, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into the hidden machinery of World War II. And meet me in the comments. If you could take one lesson from this story and apply it to today, under the sea, in the air, in cyberspace, or in industry, which lesson would you choose, and what would it change? I'm reading every response, and the most compelling idea will chart our next course.